In September 2003, some of Southern California's most elite wine lovers gathered at Melisse, a Santa Monica restaurant, to attend a $4,800 wine tasting hosted by Rudy Kurniawan. This was his coming out party in the ultra-exclusive wine world where he wanted to show that he was someone who belonged. While sampling rare wines that can be impossible to find, a few attendees were suspicious that they were being deceived. Prominent wine taster Paul Wasserman, whose mother was a prominent Burgundy importer, was unsure of the bottles he was served. Before the tasting, the oldest Petrus he'd had was from 1975, much older than the 1921 Petrus on offer that night. Vintage bottles of Petrus sold for almost $30,000 a bottle, and Kurniawan had an extensive supply. The two bottles that confused him the most were a 1961 Bordeaux that seemed far younger than Wasserman would have expected, and a 1947 Bordeaux that seemed to taste wrong. It's common for people to question the wine in the world of rare wines, although they would rarely do it out loud. Guests at tastings would want to avoid offending the host or making themselves look ignorant. When another guest told Wasserman that the 1961 Bordeaux tasted exactly the same as the last time they had it, he told himself it must be legitimate. Nothing about the wine's appearance seemed off, the colors were appropriate, and the labels seemed legitimate. Born in Indonesia, Kurniawan came to the United States to attend California State University on a student visa in the late 90s. His interest in wine started in 2001 at his father's birthday party. He tried a 1996 Opus 1, was fascinated by the taste. Living in the LA area at the time, he started searching the city for wine and soon had 200 bottles. He attended weekly tastings at a wine store in Glendale called The Red Carpet. At a charity auction in 2002, he bid on a hotly contested bottle of the cult California Syrah Sine Qua Non. He held his paddle up and waited until he won. Soon, he graduated from California Wines, moving on to Premier Cru Bordeaux. From there, his attention turned to Burgundy. Burgundy is one of the market's most revered wines. Produced in such small quantities that finding bottles can be a huge feat. Kurniawan had a refined palate and a strong memory, two traits that made him a gifted taster. He visited auction rooms and spent $1 million a month, becoming a strong presence in the market. His high bidding was so influential that old wine prices rose dramatically during that time. A bottle of 1945 DRC Romani Conti sold for $2,600 in 2002, but after Kurniawan joined the scene in 2003, it sold for $124,000. Kurniawan had a flashy sense of style, turning up to events in custom Hermes suits, Patek Philippe watches, Selvedge jeans, chrome hearts glasses, and crocodile boots. Inside his jacket's flap was a silk lining with a repeating cursive print of Rudy. He teased people for having a platinum Amex card when he had a Centurion card. While he sometimes had a woman on his arm or a brother visiting from Asia, he attended most events alone. Usually, he was about an hour late, which sometimes rubbed people the wrong way as he was seen as arrogant. It was rare that he spoke about his past. He'd tell people he moved from Indonesia to the US to attend Cal State and that his family owned a major Asian beer distributor. Apparently, his family gave him a monthly allowance to stay out of their hair. The little information he shared about his life changed frequently. Sometimes his monthly allowance was $1 million, and others it was as high as $2 million. Other details like the type of beer his family made also changed often. Few people knew details beyond that. Wasserman invited him over for dinner, but he always had an excuse for not going. He didn't seem to want to get too close to people. While he was distant, he was also very generous. The lineup of wines he had at tastings became critically renowned, with Wasserman singing his praises and Alan Meadows, a Burgundy collector and premier Burgundy critic, becoming a beneficiary of Kurniawan's largesse, having tried wines he'd never encountered before. Kurniawan was accepted and revered in the wine community, with Meadows even publishing tasting notes based on Kurniawan bottles. Arguably, Kurniawan's most strategic friendship was with John Capon, a New Yorker who wanted to turn his family's wine shop in the Upper West Side, Acker, Merrill, and Condit, into a key player at wine auctions. Capon introduced Kurniawan to the 12 Angry Men, a New York-based group of new collectors known for their high standards and who would be offended if somebody brought brought a cheap bottle of wine to a party. This connection was highly beneficial to Kurniawan, as the more he integrated himself into high-end wine circles, the more legitimate he looked. He had a fixation on Romani Conti and the 1947 vintage, earning him the nicknames Dr. Conti and Mr. 47. They would make a grandiose display of opening rare, expensive bottles at their tastings. Still, as Kurniawan integrated himself more into their circle, he opened bottles that outdid anything the 12 Angry Men produced. Online wine boards sang his praises as well. He'd post his tasting notes and be met with high praise. Some critics didn't like how much he was flaunting his wealth by talking about such expensive wines, but other online community members were quick to defend him, claiming that those critics were just jealous. He made his mark on the scene. The group would start their evenings at Kurniawan's, where they'd drink hyper rarities, like a bottle of 1945 Romani Conti that he supposedly bought for $2 million. They would leave Kurniawan's place and go to Crew, a Greenwich Village restaurant where he would order all of the expensive bottles off the wine list. After drinking expensive wine at Crew, Kurniawan had the restaurant send him the empty bottles. Wine aficionados often hold on to the bottles of costly or hard-to-find wines they've drunk, so it wasn't an unusual request. He told them he was building a bottle museum, which might have explained why he ordered more bottles than any other customer and took most of them home. Kurniawan was co-signing at auctions despite earning a reputation as a wine lover and buyer rather than a seller. In 2003, Eric Greenberg, an internet entrepreneur, knew something was wrong with the wine he purchased and reached out to Kurniawan. By the end of the conversation, Greenberg was sure Kurniawan was duped by whomever originally sold him the wine. Cap'n hosted a top 100 wines of the country weekend, charging $17,500 a head. Attendees tried 2 vintage bottles of Domaine de la Romani Conti. One bottle was a 1937, the other a 1945, which were rare finds that Kurniawan sold to Cap'n. Something tasted off with the wines, but most of them had never tried the 45 vintage before, and so weren't sure how it was supposed to taste. Meadows joked about only how there were probably less than 1,000 bottles of the 45 made, but many thousands of bottles had been drunk, insinuating that whoever sold Kurniawan the wine had lied to him. Nobody blamed Kurniawan, assuming that with his extensive collection, he was bound to end up with a few phony bottles. Cap'n believed Kurniawan's cellar was the greatest in the country, presided over Kurniawan's wine cellar auction, and called it the cellar. While the consignor was unnamed, insiders knew it was Kurniawan. Acker Auctions was a second-tier auction house, meaning they received consignments of a couple of bottles rather than an entire case. The cellar would be Acker's first single cellar sale. They sold 1,742 lots and brought in $10.6 million. It was such a hit that they held the Cellar 2 auction 9 months later, selling 2,310 lots at $24.7 million. Acker was now a key player in wine auctions. Kurniawan made $35 million from the auction. He splurged on exotic cars, including a Bentley and a Ferrari, started gutting an $8 million Bel Air house, and spent millions of dollars on contemporary art. He spoke to a reporter about the inevitability of encountering fake bottles, and that spotting them was an art he learned after trying so many wines and inspecting details like the bottles, labels, and corks. Some people were growing skeptical of Kurniawan. His bottles were rare, so having just one of them would be impressive, but he had entire cases. He brought bottles of 1923 Rumier Bonus Maris to auction, but the Domaine wasn't found until 1924. In 2007, leading Burgundy collector Don Stott hosted an event at his home with Christophe Roumier to sample some of Kurniawan's bottles. A guest pointed out that something was wrong with one of the bottle labels. While the details were correct, their position was reversed, as though the label was photocopied. It was clear that 6 out of the 11 bottles they opened were fake. Doug Barzilay, a Burgundy collector and good friend to Meadows, wondered if Kurniawan was intentionally selling fakes. It seemed like Kurniawan had been duped for a while, but it was happening so often that he could be participating in the operation. Bottles of fake wine were in circulation, and members of the scene needed to find out how. Stott started returning bottles he bought from Kurniawan to Acker, and Crew began destroying all empty bottles. Noted wine collector Bill Koch hired an investigator to search his 43,000 bottle cellar for counterfeits. He hired an investigator who sent 4 Kurniawan source bottles to be inspected at their respective French chateaux. The chateaux reported that each bottle was fake. Kurniawan's mysterious wealth was running out. Construction on his Bel Air mansion came to a halt after he received 8 different lawsuits and countersuits. Acker filed a $1 million lien against him, and the money continued to grow, likely due to collectors returning bottles. By the end of that year, he'd racked up $7 million in debt to the auction house. He reached out to wine friends to lend him $1 million, and soon, he was $11.5 million in debt. To obtain loans, he understated his liabilities and double-pledged collateral. He scrambled to find new outlets to sell more wine. In an April 2007 auction in Los Angeles, Christie's Los Angeles sent out a catalog that featured magnums of 1982 Le Pin, sourced by Kurniawan. Aficionados determined they were fakes, and they were pulled. Kurniawan sold $2.2 million worth of wine to Goldman Sachs partner and chairman of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Faking wine might be easier than it sounds and can be done by blending two vintage bottles. For example, a 1981 Petrus with a 1983 Petrus would theoretically make two bottles of 82 Petrus. While it might not taste exactly like an 82, it would be different enough from the 81 and 83 to be plausible, and this is precisely what Kurniawan did. Wines didn't always brand their corks with the winemaker, making it possible to put in a blank cork or ink it with the name of a winemaker. Labels can be soaked off an empty bottle and replaced with a laser-printed new one. Proving that old wines are fake is almost impossible. There isn't information about how many bottles of a particular wine were produced and what packaging was used. Old and rare wines aren't tasted enough for their flavors to be recognizable. Diagnosing a fake bottle is very difficult. Winemakers rarely declare a bottle as fake. Rare wines are typically opened by a generous host, so nobody would dare say they were drinking a fake. Most people in the collector's community were male and loved to show off their collections to anybody they encountered. Nobody in the group would admit to being duped. During an April 2008 Acker auction, Laurent Ponceau, maker of a coveted Burgundy featured in 22 lots at the auction, discovered that Kurniawan co-signed counterfeit vintages. Ponceau started making Domaine Ponceau in the 80s, but the catalog boasted 1959 and 1945 vintages. Barzilay told Ponceau about the situation, and they ordered Capin to pull the lots. Ponceau attended the auction to make sure that he did. The crowd started booing when Capin announced that they'd removed the Ponceau lots. It was a rowdy night, with the angry men's notes on the wines they drank getting more outrageous, and they seemed to want to bid on the wines anyway. Pulling so many bottles for being fake made Capin look completely illegitimate to an already suspicious group of experts, especially when it was becoming accepted that many of the wine lots he was selling were fake. The next day, Kurniawan and Capin had lunch with Ponceau and Barzilay. Kurniawan was evasive, saying he'd have to check his records to see where he got the bottles. Later, he emailed Ponceau to tell him that he bought the wines from a man named Pak Hendra in Asia. He gave Ponceau two numbers to call, but one went to a Jakarta shopping mall and the other to an Indonesian airline. To rebuild his reputation, Capin stopped accepting Kurniawan's consignments. Kurniawan's relationships with many people that he was once close with soured. Alan Meadows felt that Kurniawan took advantage of him, and some of the group wondered if he was opening authentic wines at tastings but selling counterfeit versions. He found a major auction house, Christie's New York, still willing to take his bottles. At the time, Christie's wine department was losing its footing in the market and needed product. Don Cornwell, a lawyer and wine aficionado, tried to warn Christie's about the fake bottles, but they still went ahead with the auction. A London auction was coming up, and Cornwell took to the popular online forum Wine Berserkers to warn that Kurniawan would be trying to auction wines there, but still wasn't taken seriously. A president of one of the two auction houses holding the sale responded that they had a thorough inspection process to weed out any fakes. The situation reached British online wine media and pressured auctioneers to withdraw inventory from Kurniawan, including 12 lots of DRC worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bill Koch filed a civil case in 2009 against Kurniawan that was finally able to proceed after a breakthrough. The FBI had been quietly investigating him and discovered that he had lived in the country illegally since 2003 after the denial of his asylum application. His status turned him into a flight risk, leading the FBI to file a search warrant. On March 8, 2012, FBI agents knocked on his door early in the morning, and he was arrested in his pajamas. During their search of the house, the FBI found thousands of labels for top wines, including a 1947 Lafleur, Lafite, Romani Conti, and a 1950 Petrus, as well as hundreds of new and cold corks. He had a mechanical device for inserting them, lead capsules, sealing wax, and rubber stamps with vintages and chateau names. They also found glue, stencils, pattern scissors, and warm white Ingress drawing paper. He had detailed instructions on fabricating labels for 1962 Domaine Ponceau Clos de Roche and bottles of cheap Napa Valley wine that he'd marked with the names of old Bordeaux wines. Bottles were soaking in the kitchen sink to make it easier to remove their labels. The evidence against Kernyawan didn't just hurt his reputation. People who went into business with him dealt a blow to their credibility, like Paul Wasserman, who stored and traded some of his wine. Many believe that Wasserman was too much of an expert in the field to be deceived by Kernyawan. His respected family name was tarnished, and his knowledge of old wine was questioned. After all, he posted tasting notes of Kernyawan's wines. Capin and Meadows also wrote notes on Kernyawan wines, having given him the benefit of the doubt despite indicators that he wasn't who he seemed. Wasserman hoped he'd once sold legitimate wines and only started co-signing counterfeit bottles when he faced financial troubles. After being indicted in New York, Kernyawan faced up to 100 years in jail for 4 counts of mail and wire fraud. Directors Jerry Rothwell and Reuben Atlas met at Kernyawan's trial. Rothwell was following Lauren Ponceau on the trial of his counterfeit wine. Atlas read about the trial in New York Magazine and was intrigued by Kernyawan, who at his core was a thief but only stole from the wealthy. The pair spent a lot of time together and soon decided to tell Kernyawan's story. Earlier in his career, he was followed by a film crew and intended to make a food and wine show, although it never materialized. Atlas and Rothwell obtained the footage and began making the documentary Sour Grapes. Originally, they wanted an interview with Kernyawan, but never got time with him. The story's angle changed, and their focus went from the con man to the con. Some collectors didn't want to be filmed as they were too embarrassed that they were duped. At first, Atlas was rooting for Kernyawan, who targeted people with money to blow. At the time, his opinion changed after learning more about the people he conned and the winemaking process. Cox investigators were the first to discover that Kernyawan's real name was Zhen Wang Huang, although he didn't find this suspicious as ethnic Chinese often adopt local names. Kernyawan wasn't the first person in his family to act as a con man. His uncles were imprisoned for committing massive fraud, allegedly stealing $800 million that was never recovered. As of February 2012, Kernyawan still owed $3.5 million to Acker, Merrill, and Condit from loans they'd given him. In April 2013, Kernyawan faced 2 additional charges, one for selling 6 bottles of Domaine Georges Roumier Bon Maris 1923 for $95,000, worth just under $130,000 today, despite Domaine Georges Roumier not producing wine until 1924, and another for selling Jeroboam of Chateau Mouton Rothschild 1945 for almost $50,000, worth roughly $65,000 in today's money. In December 2013, the jury found him guilty, and in August 2014, he received a 10-year sentence in federal prison. Koch and Kernyawan settled their lawsuit out of court in July 2013 for $3 million in damages. In January 2015, the authentic wines in his collection sold for $1.5 million. After his November 2020 release, Immigration and Customs Enforcement took him into custody, and in April 2021, they deported him back to Indonesia. All told, he sold roughly 12,000 fake bottles, thousands of which are probably still in people's private collections. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you'd rather do. Be gifted a $10,000 bottle of wine and have to drink it, or take $500 cash.